maybe. So this webinar is co-hosted and supported by the GreenGov Council and Penn State Sustainability Institute. Again, I'm Mark Hand, the GreenGov Director. The GreenGov Council was established by the Governor's Executive Order 2019-01, which established the first climate goals for Pennsylvania. It sets the goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050, and it also sets a number of lead by example goals for specific to Commonwealth agencies, such as fleet electrification goals, high performance buildings, energy reduction goals, and use of renewable electricity. So we definitely would encourage you to take a look at our website. There's lots of resources that we've been accumulating over the last couple of years. Our website is www.dgs.pa.gov/GreenGov. You can also oftentimes just Google PA GreenGov Council to get directly to our website. That way we have 2 years of annual reports that show the roll-up of agency achievements. We now have a GreenGov quarterly newsletter, which you can sign up for to get information on how agencies are working towards the goals and what we are working towards together on sustainability, and a number of other things like updates on our GreenGov agency certification checklist. So now I'd like to turn the program over to our partner at Penn State Sustainability Institute, Peter Boger, who's Assistant Director of Community Engagement at Penn State. Peter is going to give a little bit of an overview of the Sustainability Institute and then also introduce our guest speaker for today. Peter?
Thank you so much, Mark. Hope everybody can hear me. And welcome, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us for, as Mark said, the last webinar in this series. We've been really thrilled to partner with the GreenGov Council. We see our mission as being in parallel to the GreenGov Council, in that in both cases, neither one of us is the owner of sustainability, either for the state government or for Penn State University, but instead we are facilitators, we are networkers. And in activities such as this, we are trying to bring people together to empower you to bring sustainability into your organizations, whether it's on campus, whether it's in state government, whether it's in municipal government, and really trying to see how we can bring people together to make sustainability a collective goal for all of us. So the Sustainability Institute operates to try to institutionalize sustainability across Penn State's teaching, research, student engagement, co-curricular engagement, community engagement, and operations. And so similar to the GreenGov Council, our mission is how do we empower Penn State University to work faster towards its goals? How do we bring people together in settings such as this? And we really are excited to be bringing you a preeminent scholar from Penn State who has a personal connection to the Sustainability Institute through his wife, Mary, who just recently retired after being a stalwart member of our staff. But it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our guest today, Dr. William Easterling III. Recently completed a 4-year term as Assistant Director of the National Science Foundation in charge of the Geosciences Directorate, which is overseeing an annual budget of approximately $1.3 billion to support fundamental research in the atmospheric and geospace sciences, ocean science, solid earth science, and polar programs. He also co-chairs the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology for the White House National Science and Technology Committee. A fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Meteorological Society, he was previously the Dean of Penn State's College of Earth and Mineral Sciences from 2007 to 2017, and continues as a professor of geography and earth system science. He is an internationally recognized expert on how climate change likely will affect the Earth's food supply, and was nominated by the White House to serve as a convening lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Fourth Assessment Report's chapter on food, fiber, forestry, and fisheries. He was also the lead author on the 2015 USDA report entitled Climate Change, Global Food Security, and the U.S. Food System. On matters of climate change and food, he has testified before Congress, given invited briefings to committees and subcommittees of the US Senate and House of Representatives, delivered numerous invited presentations and keynote speeches, and authored more than 80 refereed scientific publications. And I have vastly condensed what is just an amazing resume and left out many important parts, to be sure, but I wanted to get to our guest today and turn the floor over to Bill. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to the GreenGov Council for this opportunity. This is my first official presentation since leaving NSF to come back to Penn State, so quite an honor to be here. I am coming to you from a hotel in Kilmarnock, Virginia, and so I'll warn you, the bandwidth is not that great here. If I have problems, bear with me. It comes and goes, but seems to be good right now. I chose this title, Climate Change, Adaptation, or Mitigation, A Fool's Choice, for a reason. For those who maybe aren't familiar with fool's choice, it's believing that there's only one choice between two or more options, when in fact there truly are multiple choices. And adaptation to climate change is coping with climate change, recognizing that you can't just take it laying down, but it buys you time to mitigate climate change, where mitigation is things that you all know or have perhaps even participated in, aimed at halting or slowing the warming. And both obviously are needed. And that said, the focus of my talk today is on my particular specialty, and that's adapting to climate changes. So I want to really just work with you today to help you think about future climate adaptation. So that's our objective. And you know, I posed first the question, well, why is adaptation so important? It may seem commonsensical, but there are some really powerful reasons. And for one, the Earth's climate, we know, is committed to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius more warming, which is again 1.5 as much warming as we've experienced since 1900, even if greenhouse gas emissions were immediately brought to nothing, to zero, which is obviously a impossible task. And so the climate is going to change, and we're going to have to adapt to a certain amount of that change. Impacts are already being felt from current climate changes that we know have been underway for decades, and there are reasons to believe that climate vulnerabilities are increasing, led by population change, population growth, and a host of factors that I won't go into deeply here. So I've arranged a series of what I call take-home points. And when one thinks about climate change and its effects on ecosystems and more broadly society, it's important to realize that this is happening now, and it will continue to happen out into the future, and that nothing is going to stand still while the climate changes. An important point. Society will continue to evolve, as will the biosphere. And I've tried to pitch this talk a little bit toward Pennsylvania, but it's a mix of Pennsylvania and the globe as a whole. And of course, many of you know better than I that Pennsylvania population growth is underway. It's expected to grow to a little over 14 million by 2040, up from the 12.7 million at the 2010 census, and this is from the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. And although there's much more texture than I'll share here as to what that growth will look like. But about 85% of that increase will be from overseas migrants coming into Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania ranks third nationally in the production of all forms of energy. I led a college at Penn State that has energy engineering in it, and we were just totally involved in the rise of the shale gas resource for Pennsylvania back in the mid to 2010s. And by 2040, Pennsylvania is predicted to produce about 40% of the nation's natural gas, this coming from the Pennsylvania Center for Strategic and International Studies. Pennsylvania ranks 35th in land and agricultural production, which may not sound like it's a lot, but recognize that we're 14th in the country in value of agricultural products sold. So there's a lot of market value to the agricultural production in this state. And one of the changes that will happen along with climate change, focusing on Pennsylvania, is that there will be continued competition between urban and agricultural land uses. And some of the best agricultural land in Pennsylvania is within a stone's throw of major urban centers that are competing for that land. So lots will happen over the next 25 to 50 years, along with the change in climate, and those will all interact. And so keep that in mind as we go through this. Technological changes will continue to transform society pretty much as they have throughout human history. But I put this big statement up there because recognize that that we are not without tools to deal with the climate changes as they occur. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on agriculture and food today. So my examples will come from that area, but you can imagine that this is a statement that would apply to many other sectors that you have responsibility for in state government. And so just a little interesting, fun thought exercise, just again to reinforce the point that technology is continually changing, and that you can't freeze in a single point in time and expect to be able to know exactly what's going to happen out into the future. For example, things that are about a decade or less old. This is just something that anybody can do with a laptop and more time on their hands than they probably should have. Smartwatches. Twitter is less than a decade old. Self-driving cars, at least in a practical sense. Multiple use space rockets. The e-reader Kindle. These are all things that you may take for granted, but they're not that old. iPad tablets. But how good are we at delivering transformative adaptation under pressure when it really counts to be able to adapt? Well, history says we've done reasonably well. When we were looking for a way to end World War II, it wasn't pretty, but the Manhattan Project was very effective from a scientific, technological standpoint of delivering the scientific know-how and the technological capability to end the war very quickly, saving a lot of American lives. The moon landing. Many of you may have been old enough to remember, if not hearing it, reading about it, President Kennedy's proclamation that we'll put a person on the moon before the end of the 1960s. That was uttered in 1960, and we succeeded. and sequencing the human genome a little bit closer to the present. Another just amazing technological accomplishment that, again, demonstrates our ability, when we want to spin up a suite of technological capabilities and solutions to major challenges that we're confronted with. And so I ask, how about adapting to an intensifying climate change? And that's, again, the question that we'll talk about today. So the next take-home point is the climate is already changing and there are impacts. I'm going to focus just very briefly on this, on agriculture, and try to focus again on the northeastern U.S. This is a study that was done back in about 6 years ago, and essentially what it gave us the capability of doing is sorting out how much of recent U.S. crop yield, actually it was global, but I'm going to focus on U.S. crop yield variability, might be due to climate variability versus all the other factors that influence the variation in crop yields from year to year. And most areas, including Pennsylvania in the Northeast, where up to 30% of maize or corn yields was due to climate variability over the last 30 years, is circled there for you to appreciate. And so climate variability is a factor in agriculture today, and it is already ipso facto forcing agricultural adaptation. So take home point number 4, we need to take stock of adaptive capabilities and needs. And I'm deliberately taking a very broad and non-technical approach to this, and I'd be happy to dive into more technological questions in the Q&A afterwards. But there, in the scientific literature, 2 forms of adaptation that we talk about. The first is what we call autonomous adaptation, and this is broadly undirected, spontaneous changes in the existing system that requires no particular prompting to begin taking place, to kicking in. And in the agriculture world, it's the sorts of technologies that currently exist. Farmers are quite acquainted with the technologies and routinely make decisions unassisted, unprompted, to, for example, change the types of cultivars, the varieties of the crops that they grow. In this case, in order to choose ones that might actually do better under a longer growing season, because as the climate warms, we know that the growing seasons will lengthen. And this gives farmers an opportunity to take advantage of that additional warmth. Or planting schedules can be altered. It may seem commonsensical, and it is commonsensical, and it's done. When farmers have the opportunity to plant earlier, they get out in the fields and they plant earlier. If they have to plant later, they have certain technologies that can help them through a shorter growing season because of muddier fields, if that's what is causing the problem. And irrigation, again, where it's appropriate, we already have much of the infrastructure in place to be able to begin starting to use that more frequently. So these are the sort of commonsensical things that that farmers will do. Nobody has to tell them to do it. That's the first round or first level of adaptation. And as I said, there are literally dozens of known autonomous adaptation strategies. But the problem is that the climate changes that are yet to come may be outstripping the effectiveness of known technologies. And I ask rhetorically, how might we know this? Well, yields are continuing to rise overall globally due to technological advances. But FAO, the World Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, which routinely tracks crop yields all over the world, has signaled that the advances, the technological advances that have continued through the last 50 to 75 years to give us amazing increases, annual increases in crop yields, may be running a little bit on empty. We're seeing a slower rate than without climate change. And this is just it's a busy graph, but I just want to show a couple of things here. These are projections of crop yields for 4 of the major cereal crops: maize, rice, wheat, and soybean. And the dashed lines, and I'm going to focus on maize or corn here just for illustration, is the growth that was projected to be the growth that is needed to achieve a doubling by 2050. And most agricultural economists have projected that we will probably need to achieve a doubling of crop yields in order to meet world agricultural demand by the middle of this century, or perhaps a little bit later than that, but roughly on that time scale. And the solid line, again in black, is again for corn, is the projected current growth. So as you can see, we're falling short, and the amount that we fall short increases as we go further and further out into this century. So there are many things that could render this projection invalid, that might make it better for us in the long run. But for now, this is one very troubling sign that we're not increasing our yields at the rate that we need. So the numbers here suggest that we need something bigger than unmanaged autonomous adaptation. I think that I've made that case fairly clear here. And that's where we come into the second form of adaptation, what we call transformational adaptation, which would include planned efforts by governments at all levels: local, regional, state, federal, in order to orchestrate major non-marginal change. So a friend of mine, Bob Cates, who wrote this paper back in 2012, kind of laid out what classes of transformational adaptation look like. One is where the adaptation occurs because we're able to hasten the pace or enlarge the scale or intensity of localized adaptation. And a good example here would be efforts to widen out or broaden out water and soil conservation practices, disseminate them more effectively, or shortening the period for cultivar development and testing. Right now, it takes about 10 to 12 years on average for a new crop cultivar with certain desirable characteristics, perhaps water use efficiency, to be developed, tested, field tested, and then eventually released to the market. We can do better. We can make it happen faster. We certainly saw that with the COVID vaccines. We could certainly do the same in agricultural cultivar development. The second form is truly novel adaptations that have never before been tried in a particular system. And of course, you immediately think of genetic modification and the insertion of new DNA into a genome that gives new traits to that genome that are in one way or another helpful under climate change. And then thirdly, adaptation that simply transforms places. I had to look a little bit, but I found an interesting example of this historically, and that was the change from small multi-crop farming systems that existed across the Lake Erie region from the inception of this country to with European settlement of this country, of this state, to the 19th century, where a remarkable transition to truck farming took place, and today up in that region, truck farming is the dominant form of agriculture. So are these strategies difficult to induce? Well, yes, absolutely. But quite frankly, we have no alternatives. So I would argue that history gives us a lot of confidence that we can, in fact, transform agriculture if there's a reason to do it. And let's take a look at what happened. Now, mind you, this isn't Pennsylvania. This is the national workforce, the percentage of the national workforce employed in agriculture from 1900 all the way up to closer to the present. So in 1900, almost 41%, darn close to half of the nation's workforce were farmers in one form or another. By 1945, half a century later, 16%, less than half, are employed in agriculture. By 2002, it's down to under 2%. And 2016, the latest I had numbers, 1.4% of the nation's workforce is employed in agriculture. That's an amazing transformation. But there's more. The number of labor hours required to grow 100 bushels of wheat, this speaks to technology. Almost 150 hours to grow 100 bushels of wheat in 1900. 14 hours in 1950 and 6 hours in 1990. And my guess is it's even half of 3 hours today. The percentage of family income that your families would have spent on food. In 1900, close again to 50%, half of all income was spent on food in this country. In 1950, 30%. In 2003, we're down to 13%. And again, 2012, the latest I have numbers, 1/10 of our family income now is spent on food. We have the without a doubt, no generation alive on Earth has had access to as cheap a food as we do here in this country. And these were all part of an amazing transformation and adaptation And let me help tell the story even further. What were the proximate causes of this transformation? Maybe not the driving forces, but the proximate causes. Well, many of you know this story as well as I do. Mechanization, moving from draft animal power to the first mechanized tractors, to tractors today that are computerized, hooked to satellites, and make very, very short work out of what was done by animal power just 100 years ago. The effects of hybridization on corn yields, just another example, bringing science into play here, going from open pollinated corn to double cross, single cross, and now at the most recent time period, the promise of biotech GMO. And you can see the tremendous response that yields have had to these technical breakthroughs. But what I really want to get to is what drove our food industry to make this large leap. And it's very simple. We were challenged. Population throughout the 20th century was growing, and that by itself was increasing the demand for food. And of course, we were also exporting more food, and demand was growing globally for that matter. We were getting wealthier in this country, and thus demanding a much higher quality diet. And this has to do with the income elasticity of food demand. And as we become wealthier, that, diet of nothing but grain and a few vegetables begins to look a lot worse than that steak that you can now buy because you're wealthier. Industrialization occurring throughout the really the 18th, later 18th, as well as the 19th and 20th centuries, took steadily farm labor away from the farm and put it in higher paying industry jobs. And let's face it, farming was very risky in that day, and it still is, still very weather dependent. And very importantly, agriculture became very science-based. You had the rise of the land-grant university concept and the infusion of organized, funded science and scientific research that helped develop so many of the technological capabilities that farmers now enjoy. So now we're being challenged in a different way as we look forward. And the question is, will we rise to these challenges the same way that we did in agriculture back in the 19th and 20th centuries? Food demand is increasing on a 30 to 40 year doubling path. This is globally, but it doesn't matter because we're producing food in this country to meet a global demand. Yield increases may be slowing. There's evidence to suggest that we may be getting to the end of our ability to eke more agricultural productivity, crop productivity, out of the current genetic composition of our major food crops, down to less than 1% per year, where we have enjoyed yield increases steadily at 2 to 3% per year in the recent past. The best potential remaining new cropland carries very high environmental opportunity costs. So we're not going to get a lot more food out of just simply plowing more land. We've put most of the best agricultural land, and you could say this in Pennsylvania for sure, already under the plow, and that which remains carries very high environmental opportunity costs. Climate change is already affecting crop yields, and there's no, in my view, indication that adaptation is revving up specifically for climate change adaptation as much as it could. So what are some logical first steps toward transformational adaptation? Well, you may have actually, you probably haven't heard of the yield gap unless you live in my little corner of science. But we often talk about the yield gap in agriculture, where we mean it is the yield difference between what farmers usually get from their fields and what they could get with optimum cultivar choices and cultural practices, and of course a little help from the weather. So this is all to say that no farmer is perfect. In fact, far from it. And they don't always make the right decisions. They don't always have the best technologies available to them, and they could benefit greatly by just better information about what they should be doing in order to adapt to constantly changing agricultural climate risks. And so narrowing the yield gap is a rallying cry in agriculture. And I've taken a little I've taken some risks here by saying that there's also an adaptation gap. The level of adaptive success of farmers using only limited adaptive strategies versus what we could achieve with optimum knowledge and access to the full suite of adaptive strategies would help us narrow the adaptation gap as well. So let me just stop here. I've spoken for about as long as I felt like I needed to get this issue out on the table, and I just leave you with some final thoughts before we go to the Q&A. First of all, I think the case has been made by people who are more specialized in climate science than I am. That the climate is changing, but I am a specialist to be able to say that adaptation to climate change is already happening. And I believe that transformational adaptation is not an option. It is a requirement for us to be able to make the transition from today's climate to the climate that we will live in 40 or 50 years. And now is the time to begin to build the toolkit for transformational adaptation. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions.